Going live, going live, going live. You're live. You're live. Okay, I won't sing anymore. Not a promise. Good evening, everybody. Hope you're ready for night 5 of our 30-minute read of The Hobbit. I can't think of a single project outside of our podcast that has gone longer than 5 episodes. But here we go. Glad you're all tuning in. I could see people jumping in, jumping out. That's all right. You can watch as long or as little as you like. Ask questions if you want. Go right ahead. Now, last time we left off where the entire party got to Rivendell and they started meeting the elves, and they're just starting to get into everything. So let's jump right into it. And here we go. Now it is a strange thing, but things are not to have good, and days are good to spend as soon as told about. And not much to listen to, while things that are uncomfortable, palpitating, and even gruesome, that may make a good tale and take a deal of telling anyway. They stayed a long, good time in that house, 14 days at least, and they found it hard to leave. Bilbo would gladly have stopped there forever and ever, even supposing a wish that would have been taken him right back to his hobbit hole without trouble. Yet there is little to tell about their stay. The master of this house was an elf friend. Wonder if that means he was an elf, or just a fancy way of saying he's an elf and a friend. Let's not get too far ahead. One of those people whose fathers came into the strange stories before the beginning of history. The wars of the evil goblins, and the elves, and the first men of the north. In those days, our tale, there was still some people who had both elves and heroes of the north for ancestors, and Elrond was the master of the house, and their chief. He was as noble and as fair in face as an elf lord, as strong as a warrior, and wise as a wizard, as vulnerable as a king of dwarves, and as kind as summer. Kind as summer. Season has a kind an emotion, I guess. He comes into many tales, but his part in the story of Bilbo's great adventure only a small one, though, as you will see if we ever get to the end of it. Foreshadowing. His house was perfect whether you liked food or sleep or work or storytelling or singing or just sitting and thinking best, or a pleasant mixture of them all. Hold on. I feel a sneeze building. It's driving me nuts. Oh, one more. No? Okay. Evil things did not come into that valley. I wish I had time to tell you even a few of the tales of one or two of the songs that they heard in that house. All of them, the ponies as well, grew refreshed and strong in the few days there. Their clothes were mended as well as their bruises, their tempers, and their tenders, and their hopes. Their bags were filled with food and provisions, light to carry but strong to bring them into the mountain passes. Their plans were improved with the best advice. So the time came Midsummer's Eve, and they were going to go on again with the early sun on midsummer morning. Elrond knew all about the runes of every kind. That day he looked at the swords they had brought from the troll's lair and said, "These are not troll-made. They are old swords, very old swords, of the high elves of the west, my kin. They were made in Gondolin, for the Goblin Wars. They must have come from a dragon's horde or goblin plunder, for dragons and goblins destroyed that city many years ago. This, Thorin, the runes named Ocrist, the Goblin Cleaver, in the ancient tongue of Gondolin. It was a famous blade. And Gandalf, this is Glamdring, foe hammer, that the king of Gondolin once wore. Keep them well." "Whence did the trolls get them, I wonder?" said Thorin, looking at his sword with new interest. "I could not say," said Elrond, "but one may guess that your trolls had plundered other plunderers, or come onto the remnants of old robberies in some hole in the mountain of old. I have heard that there were still forgotten treasures of old to be found in the destroyed caverns of the mines of Moria, since the dwarf and goblin war." Thorin pondered these words. "I will keep this sword in honor," he said. "May it soon cleave goblins once again." "A wish that is likely to be granted soon enough in the mountain," said Elrond. "But show me your map." He took it and gazed long at it, and he shook his head. For it did not altogether approve of dwarves and their love of gold. He hated dragons and their cruel wickedness, and he grieved to remember the ruin of the town of Dale, and its merry bells, and the burned banks of the bright running river. The moon was shining in a broad silver crescent. He held up the map, and the white light shone through it. "What is this?" he said. "There are moon letters here, beside the plain runes, which say, 5 feet high, the door and 3 may walk abreast." I guess don't be. You gotta. That ceiling fan's powerful. It's blowing the pages everywhere. "What are moon letters?" asked the Hobbit, full of excitement. He loved maps, as I have told you before, and he also liked runes and letters and cunning handwriting. Though he wrote himself, it was bit thin and spidery. "Moon letters are rune letters, but you cannot see them," said Elrond. "Not when you look straight at them. They can only be seen when the moon shines behind them, and what is more, with the more cunning sort, it must be a moon in the same shape and the same season as the day when they were written. The dwarves invented them and wrote them with silver pens. As your friends could tell you, these must have been written on a midsummer's eve in a crescent moon a long while ago." "What do they say?" asked Gandalf and Thorin together, a bit vexed. Perhaps even Elrond should have found this out, though really there had been not any chance before, and there would not have been another good unless who knows when. "Stand by the grey stone when the thrush knocks," read Elrond, "and the setting sun, with the last light of Durin's day, will shine upon this keyhole." "Durin! Durin!" said Thorin. "He was the father of the fathers of the eldest race of dwarves, the Longbeards, and my first ancestor. I am his heir." Then what is Durin's day?" said Elrond. "The first day of the dwarves' new year," said Thorin, "is all that you should know the first day of the last moon of autumn on the threshold of winter. We still call it Durin's Day, when the last moon of autumn and the sun are in the sky together. But this will not help us much, I fear, as it passes our skill in those days to guess when such a time will come again." "That remains to be seen," said Gandalf. "Is there any more writing?" "None to be seen by this moon," said Elrond, and he gave the map back to Thorin, and then they went down to the water to see the elves dance and sing upon the midsummer's eve. The next morning was the midsummer's morning, as fair and as fresh as could be dreamed. Blue sky, never a cloud, and the sun dancing on the water. Now they rode away, amid songs of farewell and good speed, with their hearts ready for more adventure, and with the knowledge that the road must follow over the misty mountains to the land beyond. And they got like a little picture here of, we're gonna do pictures. Why not? A little picture of Rivendell. Let's see if we can. Yeah, there you go. Not much. But there it is. Is that the end of the chapter? That is. Here we are, chapter 4. We're only 8 minutes in. All right, we're going to keep going. Over hill and under hill. There were many paths that led up into the mountains that made many passes over them. And most of the paths were cheats and deceptions and led nowhere to bad ends. And most of the passes were infested by evil things and dreadful dangers. The dwarves and the hobbit, helped by the wise advice of Elrond and the knowledge and memory of Gandalf, took the right road to the right pass. Long days after they had climbed out of the valley and left the last homely house miles behind them, they were still going up and up and up. It was a hard path and a dangerous path, a crooked way and a long and lonely way. Now they could only look back over the far lands which they had left laid out behind them far, far below. Far, far away to the west, where things were blue and faint, Bilbo knew they laid his own country of safe and comfortable things in his little hobbit hole. He shivered. It was getting bitter cold up here, and the wind came shrill among the rocks. Boulders, too. At times, some galloping down the mountainsides, let loose by midday sun upon the snow and passed among them, which was lucky, or over their heads, which was alarming. The nights were comfortless and chill, and they did not dare to sing or talk too loud, for the echoes were uncanny, and the silence seemed to dislike being broken, except by the noise of water and the wail of wind and the crack of stone. The summer is getting on down below, thought Bilbo, and haymaking is going on, and picnics. They will be harvesting and blackberrying before we even begin to go down to the other side at this rate. And the others were thinking equally gloomy thoughts, although they had said goodbye to Elrond in the high hope of a midsummer morning. They had spoken gaily of the passage of the mountains, and the riding swift across the lands beyond. They had thought of coming to the secret door of the lonely mountain, perhaps that very next moon of autumn, and perhaps it will be Durin's day, they had said. Only Gandalf had shaken his head and said nothing. Dwarves had not passed that way for many years, but Gandalf had, and he knew how evil and danger had grown and thriven in the wild, since the dragons had driven more men from the lands, and the goblins had spread in secret after the battle of the Mines of Moria. Even the good plans of the wise wizards like Gandalf and his good friends like Elrond go astray sometime when you are off on dangerous adventures over the edge of the wild, and Gandalf was a wise enough wizard to know it. So, just a long about way of saying, it was the rocky road, but we got smart peoples with us, or behind us. Gandalf knew that something unexpected might happen, and he hardly dared to hope that they would pass without fearful adventure over those great tall mountains with lonely peaks and valleys where no king ruled. They did not. All was well until one day they met a thunderstorm. More than a thunderstorm, a thunder battle. You know how terrific a really big thunderstorm can be down the land in the river valley? I come from Florida. I know thunder. Especially at times when two great thunderstorms met and clash. More terrible still are thunder and lightning in the mountains at night, when storms come up from the east and west and make war. The lightning splinters on the peaks and rocks shiver, and great crashes split the air, and go rolling and tumbling into every cave and hollow, and the darkness is filled with overwhelming noise and sudden light. So basically they're just trekking through Tampa without the hepatitis C. Bilbo had never seen or imagined anything of the kind. Did I miss a page? No, just the pages are super thick, so it feels like I missed a page. Let me refresh. Bilbo had never seen or imagined anything of the kind. They were high up in a narrow place, with the dreadful fall of a dim valley at one side of them. There they were sheltering under a hanging rock for the night, and when he lay beneath a blanket and shook from head to toe, when he peeped out on the lightning flashes, he saw that across the valley the stone giants were out, and they were hurling rocks at one another for game, and catching them and tossing them down into the darkness where they smashed among the trees far below, or splintered into little bits with a bang. Then came a wind and a rain, and a wind whipped the rain and the hail about in every direction, so that every overhanging rock was no protection at all. Soon they were getting drenched, and their ponies were standing in their heads. standing with their heads down and their tails between their legs, and some of them were whinnying with fright. Whinnying. Boy. They could not hear the giants guffawing and shouting over the mountainside. "This won't do at all," said Thorin. "If we don't get blown off or drowned or struck by lightning, we shall be picked up by some giant and kicked sky high for a football." They had footballs? Cool. "Well, if you know of anywhere better, take us there," said Gandalf, who was feeling very grumpy and was far from happy about the giants himself. The end of their argument was that they sent Fili and Kili to look for better shelter, and they had very sharp eyes, and being the youngest of the dwarves by some 50 years, they usually get these sort of jobs, when everybody could see that it was absolutely no use sending Bilbo. "There is nothing like looking if you want finding something," said Thorin. So Thorin said to the young dwarves. "You certainly usually find something if you look, but if it's not always quite in something you were after, so it proved on this occasion." So you want it, so you're more likely to find it. Soon Fili and Kili came crawling back, holding on to the rocks in the wind. "We have found a drive cave," they have said. "Not far around the next corner, and ponies could all get inside as well." "Have you thoroughly explored it?" said the wizard, who knew that caves up in the mountain were seldom unoccupied. Yes, they said, though everybody knew they could not have been long about it. They had come back too quick. "It isn't all that big, and it does not go far back." That, of course, is the dangerous part about caves. You don't know how far they go back, sometimes, or whether a passage behind them may lead to what is waiting for you inside. But now Fili and Kili news seemed good enough, so they all got up and prepared to move. The wind was howling and the thunder still growling, and they had a business getting themselves and their ponies along. Still was not very far to go, and before long they came to a big rock standing out into the path. If you stepped behind, you found a low arch in the side of the mountain. There was just room to get the ponies through with a squeeze. Then they had been unpacked and unsaddled. As they passed under the arch, it was good to hear the wind and rain outside instead of all about them, and to feel safe from giants and their rocks. But the wizard was taking no risks. He lit up his wand, as he did that day in Bilbo's dining room that seemed so long ago, and by its light they explored the cave from end to end. It seemed quite a fair size, but not too large and mysterious. It had a dry floor and some comfortable nooks. At one end there was room for the ponies, and there they stood, might glad of the change, too, steaming and camping in their nose bags. Oin and Gloin wanted to light a fire at the door to dry their clothes, but Gandalf would not hear of it. So they spread out their wet things on the floor and got dry ones out of their bundles. Then they made their blankets comfortable, got out their pipes and blew smoke rings, which Gandalf turned into different colors and set dancing upon the roof to amuse them. They talked, and they forgot about the storm, and discussed what each of them would do with their share of the treasure when they got it, which at the moment did not seem impossible. And so they dropped off one step by one, and that was the last time they used the ponies' packages, baggages, tools, and paraphernalia they had brought with them. It turned out a good thing that night that they had brought little Bilbo with them after all, for somehow he could not go to sleep for a long while, and when he did sleep, it was very nasty dreams. He dreamed that a crack in the wall in the back of the cave got bigger and bigger, and opened wider and wider, and he was very afraid, but could not call out to do anything but lie and look. Then he dreamed that the floor of the cave was giving away, and he was slipping, beginning to fall down, goodness knows where. At that he woke up with a horrible start, and found that part of his dream was true. A crack had opened at the back of the cave, and was already a wide passage. He was just in time to see the last of the ponies' tails disappearing into it. Of course he gave a very loud yell, a yell as loud as a hobbit can give, which is surprising for their size. Out jumped the goblins. Big goblins. Great ugly looking goblins. Lots of goblins. Lots of goblins! Before you could say rocks and blocks, there were 6 to each dwarf at least, and 2 even for Bilbo. And they were all grabbed and carried through the crack before you could say tinder and flint. But not Gandalf. Bilbo's yell had done that much good. It had wakened him up, and in the splintering second, and when the goblins came to grab him, there was a terrific flash, like lightning in the cave, a smell of gunpowder, and several of them fell dead. The crack closed with a snap, and Bilbo and the dwarves were on the wrong side of it. Where was Gandalf? Of that neither they nor the goblins had any idea, and the goblins did not wait to find out. They seized Bilbo and the dwarves and hurried them along. Water burp. Sorry, that was rude. They seized Bilbo and the dwarves and hurried them along. It was deep, deep, dark, such as only goblins that have taken to living in the hearts of the mountains can see through. The passages there were crossed and tangled in all directions. But the goblins knew their way as well as you do to the nearest post office. That's such a strange comparison. And the way down, and it was most horribly stuffy. The goblins were very rough and pinched unmercifully, and chuckled and laughed in their horrible stony voices. And Bilbo was more unhappy even than when the trolls had picked him up by his robes. He wished again for the night. He wished again for his nice, bright hobbit hole, not for the last time. Sorry, I thought I silenced my phone. Let me turn that off. Sorry about that. All right. Oh, God, there's singing coming up. God help me. Now there came a glimmer of red light before them. The goblins began to sing, or croak, keeping time with the flap of their feet onto the stone, shaking their prisoners as well. Clap, snap, the black crack. Grip, grab, pinch, nab, and down go the goblin town you go, my lad. Crash, clash, crush, smash, hammer and tongs, knocker and gongs, pound, pound, far underground, ho, ho, my lad. Swish, smack, whip, crack, batter and beat, yammer and bleat, work, work, not dare to shriek, while goblins quaff and goblins laugh, round and round, far underground, below, my lad. I have no idea if that's how the song goes. I know they sung it in the movie, but I don't really remember it. It sounded truly terrifying. The walls echoed to clap, snap, and then crush, smash, and to the ugly laughter of their ho, ho, my lad. The general meaning of the song was only too plain, for now the goblins took out whips and whipped them with such swish, smack, and set them running as fast as they could in front of them, and more than one of the dwarves was already yammering and bleating like anything. Bleating, not bleeding, like anything. And then they stumbled into a big cavern. It was lit by a great red fire in the middle and by torches all along the walls, and it was full of goblins. They all laughed and stamped and clapped with their hands when the dwarves, with poor little Bilbo at the back and nearest to the whips, came running in. While the goblin drivers whooped and cracked their whips behind, the ponies were already huddled in a corner, and were all the baggages and packages lying broken and being rummaged by goblins, and smelt by goblins, and fingered by goblins, and quarreled over by goblins. There's some goblins, people. I am afraid that the very last they ever saw of those excellent little ponies, including a jolly sturdy little white fellow that Elrond had lent to Gandalf, since his horse was not suitable for the mountain paths. For goblins eat horses and ponies and donkeys and much more dreadful things, and they were always hungry. Just now, however, The prisoners were thinking of only themselves. The goblins chained their hands behind their backs and linked them all together and dragged them to the far end of the cavern, with little Bilbo tugging at the end of the row. There in the shadows, on a large flat stone, sat a tremendous goblin with a huge head, and armed goblins were standing all around him, carrying the axes and the bent swords that they use. Now goblins are cruel, wicked, and black-hearted. They make no beautiful things, and they make many clever ones. They can tunnel and mine as well as any but most skilled dwarves. When they take the trouble, though, they are usually untidy and dirty. Hammers, axes, swords, daggers, pickaxes, tongs, an instrument of torture, they all make very well, or get other people to make them to their design. Prisoners and slaves that have to work until they die for want of air and light. It is not unlikely that they invented some of the machines that have since troubled the world, especially the ingenious devices of killing large numbers of people at once, for wheels and engines and explosions always delighted them, and also not wondering with their own hands more than they could help. In those days, those wild parts they had not advanced so far. They did not hate dwarves especially, no more than they hated everybody and everything, and particularly the Order of Prosperous. In some parts, wicked dwarves had even made alliances with them, but they had a special grudge against Thorin's people, because the war which you have heard mentioned, but which does not come into this tale, and any other goblins didn't care who they catch as long as it was done smart and secret, and the prisoners are not to defend themselves. "Who are these miserable persons?" said the great goblin. "Dwarves, and this," said one of the drivers, pulling Bilbo's chain so he fell forward onto his knees. "We found them sheltering on our front porch." "What do you mean by it?" said the great goblin to Thorin. "Up to no good, I'll warrant. Spying on the private business of my people, I guess. Thieves, I shouldn't be surprised to learn. Murderers and friends of elves, not unlikely. Come, what have you got to say?" "Thorin, the dwarf, at your service," he replied. It was merely a polite thing. Of the things which you suspect and imagine, we had no idea. We sheltered from a storm in what seemed a convenient cave and unused. Nothing was further from our thoughts than inconveniencing goblins in any way whatsoever. That was true enough. Said the great goblin. "So say you. Might I ask what you were doing in the mountains and all, and where you coming from and where you are going to? In fact, I should like to know all about you. Not that it will do you much good, Thorin Oakenshield. I know too much about your folk already, and it's already the truth, or I will prepare something particularly uncomfortable for you. We're on a journey to visit our relatives, our nephews and nieces, first, second, and third cousins, and the other descendants of our grandfathers who live on the east side of these truly hospitable mountains," said Thorin, not quite knowing what to say at once in the moment, when obviously the exact truth would not do at all. "He's a liar, oh truly tremendous one," said one of the drivers. "Several of our people were struck by lightning in the cave when we invited these creatures to come below, and they were as dead as stones. Has he not explained this?" He held out a sword, for which Thorin had worn. The sword came to the troll's lair. The great goblin gave truly an awful howl of rage when he looked at it, and his soldiers gnashed their teeth, clenched their shields, and stamped. They knew the sword at once. It had killed hundreds of goblins in its time, when the fair elves of Gondolin hunted them down in the hills or did battle before their walls. It had been called Oakrest, Goblin Cleaver, but the goblins simply called it Biter. They hated it, and hated worse anyone who carried it. "Murderers and elf friends!" the great goblin shouted. "Slash them, beat them, bite them, gnash them, take away to the dark halls full of snakes, and let them never see the light again." He was in such a rage that he jumped off his seat and rushed himself at Thorin with his mouth open. Just at that moment, all the lights in the cavern went out, and the great fire went poof into the tower of blue glowing smoke right up into the roof that scattered piercing white sparks all around the goblins. The yells and the yammering, croaking, gibbering and jabbering, howls, growls and curses, screeching and scratching that followed were beyond description. Several hundred wild cats and wolves being roasted slowly alive together would have not been compared to it. The sparks were burning holes in the goblins, and the smoke that now fell from the room made the air too thick for even their eyes to see through. Soon they were falling over and over one another, rolling in heaps on the floor, biting and kicking and fighting as they had all gone mad. Suddenly a sword flashed in its own light. Bilbo saw it go right through the great goblin. As he stood dumbfounded in the middle of his rage, he fell dead, and the goblin soldiers fled before the sword, shrieking into the darkness. The sword went back into its sheath. "Follow me, quick!" said a voice, fierce and quiet. Before Bilbo understood what had happened, he was trotting along again, as fast as he could trot, at the end of the line down more passages, with the yells of the goblin hall growing fainter behind him. A pale light was leading them on. "Quicker, quicker!" said the voice. "The torches will be soon relit." "Half a minute," said Dory, who was at the back next to Bilbo with a decent fellow. He made the hobbit scramble on his shoulders as best as he could, and he tied his hands with his tied hand, and then off they all went in a run, with a clink, clink of chains and many stumbles, since they had no hands to steady themselves with. Not for a long while did they stop, and by that time they must have been right down in the very mountain's heart. Then Gandalf lit up his wand. Of course it was Gandalf. I need water. I'm loving this. Of course it was Gandalf. But then they were just too busy to ask how he got there. He took out his sword again, and again it flashed in the dark by itself. It burned with rage that made a gleam if goblins were about. Now if it were as bright as blue flame for delight in the killing of the great lord of the cave, it made no trouble whatsoever of cutting through goblin chains and setting all the prisoners free as quickly as possible. The sword's name was Glamdring, the foe hammer, if you remember. The goblins just called it Beater, and hated it worse than Biter, if possible. Okris, too, had been saved, for Gandalf had brought it along as well, snatching it from the terrified guards. Gandalf thought of most things, and though he did not do everything, he could do a great deal for his friends in a tight corner. "Here we are," he said, handing his sword back to Thorin with a bow. "Let me see. 1, that's Thorin. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Where are Keely and Feely? Here they are. 12, 13. And here's Mr. Baggins, 14. Well, it might be worse. And then again, it might be a good deal better. No ponies and no food, and no knowing quite where we are, and hordes of angry goblins just behind. On we go." That's going to be 30 minutes right there. Actually, it's over 30 minutes. I just got really, really into it. But guys, tune in again. I'm going to try my best to do this again tomorrow night. Hobbit and the dwarves still in the Goblins Hall. And if you know the story, really big chapters coming up that introduces a particular piece of jewelry. So guys, thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed it. I got way into it. I went longer, but I'm going to cut it off here. We'll join again tomorrow night. And guys, thanks again for tuning in. Again, I'm not doing this for the views. I'm doing this for entertainment. So anybody who's watching this and loving it, thank you for watching. Again, good night, everyone.